that the old slave songs were appropriate for contemporary use. Oh, have we heard that before? And some of the elders still felt a stigma was attached to them. So I think the spiritual again, it's so many things. It can mean so many things to so many different people. It can conjure up all kinds of emotions, okay? And like any songs, depending on your experience, will be how those songs will affect you. So, and I think we still feel that today. You know, young people don't like to sing hymns because they old, but they're gonna get old one day, and nobody's not gonna want to sing their praise words. So it's all a cycle, and I think it's up to all generations to appreciate. Remember that you were once that young person that didn't want to sing the old songs, all of that, you know. But there's value in all of it, and what is that value? And I think it's our job to relay that value and keep those traditions alive and keep the information alive. Oh, this little light of mine. Singer, scholar, and activist Bernice Johnson Reagan talked about the bus boycott meeting. She noted that the meeting closed with a traditional spiritual sung without changing the words. She stated, this is Bernice. Here were two songs, both a part of Black traditional sacred music repertoire. One song, Old Time Religion, was updated to articulate on the immediate need of the movement. And the second, Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, ended the session. Was sung in its traditional form. On many occasions, the new moved from the old in the midst of movement activity. This evolutionary process was possible because the structure of the traditional material enabled it to function in contemporary settings. There was continuity, with some traditional lyrics being changed for statements of the moment. These transformed songs were used in conjunction with older songs to convey the message that the struggle of blacks had a long history. The spiritual faded in prominence, the spiritual faded in prominence has the nature of the civil rights movement change. Groups like the SNCC embraced the Black Power philosophy, splintering members who had opposing views of the direction of the movement. The death of MLK in 1968 also seemed not only to mark the decline of the movement, but to signal the return of the spiritual sung as folk song to a century-long slumber in the archive of America's past. This little light of mine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. And if I'm from Alabama, I might add this line. Deep down in the South, I'm gonna let it shine. Deep down in the South, I'm gonna let it shine. Deep down in the South, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. We shall overcome. We shall overcome had roots in the gospel hymns I'll Be All Right and I'll Overcome Someday by Charles Tinley. Reagan traced its use as a protest song to a 1940s union protest activities against a tobacco production company in North Carolina. When the SNCC formed in 1961, We Shall Overcome became their theme song, its most powerful means of expression. Author John Michael Spencer said, musically, the freedom songs were the paradigm of militancy. Blacks were not just singing about freedom, but were systematically seeking it. And I think we all know We Shall Overcome. And there have been many versions and variations of it. And I think, and that's how we talk about, again, the role of the freedom of the spiritual during the civil rights movement was much more of a message of we want our rights, we deserve to be here. More so, it wasn't so much the message or the coded message as it was in the previous era. Now we were stating, and it was a sense and a symbol for us to be strong, you know, as we talk to each other, as we decided to go out and protest and march and do whatever we were going to do to fight for equal rights, So that concludes my presentation on the spiritual during the civil rights movement. All right. Any questions? Yes.
What is your opinion of what role the spirituals could take in 2019 with marches and protests and 2019, 2020?
Well, I think the spiritual could now become more encompassing and more inclusive racially, or even, is racially the word? Well, yeah, culturally, or for any group that feels marginalized, I think, could draw some inspiration from some of these songs. I do think a lot of the things we see today are more about culture, lifestyle, and opinion. Race is still in there, but I think culture, lifestyle, and opinion are also a part of that. So I definitely think the spiritual can, may speak to, I'll just say it may speak to a white person who may be marginalized, more so than back in, the 50s and 60s. Yeah, so yeah, absolutely. Great question. You right?
Can you go out and teach them nation?
Can I go out and teach them? Sure. Find me a grant, and I'll happily. And that's the other great thing now. I mean, no music should be lost. We have so many ways to record things now, and again, that we didn't have before that. So that's one great thing I think about technology now. We hold on to things forever. Somebody's gonna see this 40 years from now.
I was just thinking about that too, like racially and generationally, I'm removed from this, and how do we bridge the universal story? Because it still is, it can be perceived as your story that I don't participate in type of thing, but then absolutely what Laura says is correct. If there's a universal message that, how do we transcend that?
Part of it will have to be America owning it.
Yes.
Slavery is America's greatest sin. Let's just be honest. It's what it, and it is what America is not willing to acknowledge. We'll talk all around it. So that's the start of it, because then it doesn't become just an African American thing. Then now that the country has accepted that's what it was, and that's what this music. Because you're not going to hear me. I've attended several conferences and have degrees from two very large, predominantly white institutions with degrees in music. We spent 2 weeks on spirituals, which is America's music. There's a reason why it's, and I'm not saying that the teachers purposely do it. It's systematic. It's systematic. So, we have this conversation, and we get others involved. Yeah, I think you had a question.
Sort of in response to both Laura's question and your answer, we sang at my synagogue, and we sang "Oh Freedom." It was a big concert that we with 3 parts, but we're now figuring out ways of using that in our High Holy Days liturgy.
Oh.
So these things can be carried forward. It's up to us to offer them,
Right.
and then it's up to us to accept them. But my fear is that we keep giving our programs to the same audience.
Mm-hmm.
We need to get a different audience. And when we start getting different audiences, maybe 1 or 2 of them will pick up something.
Right. And how can we relate it to, how can we make another audience see how this relates to them as well? Yeah, that's the other part of it. Dr. Hicks.
I wanted to add to that, I think it's important, just as we, even though spiritual is a folk song, and I'll talk about this in the master class, just as we would study the intent and the history behind Brahms and Beethoven and Wagner and all these composers that we would sing, the same research and intent can be applied to the foundation and the background behind the spiritual, and as well as the arrangements have modernized and they've come over time, if we always go back to that original intent, I think no matter who it is that's singing in what situation, we can deliver that same spirit, and then we can dig into how it translates to all of our situations. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child is not always about, the slave who was ripped from their mother's arms. There are children today who are ripped from their mother's arms, or grow up in these kinds of environments. So it is universal, but if we give it the same amount of respect as we would study the literature, the high art, classical literature, and getting to the meaning behind everything and why the composer did what they did, then we could all use this as a vehicle, as a tool.
Thank you, very, very true.
And I'll talk about that in a moment.
I think you're next, right? You're next.
Yeah, we'll
Dr. Hollifield.
a few minutes.
To answer your question, the gentleman is looking at which name is the last one.
Jeff.
The first one, or the second one, yes.
Jeff.
Yeah, thank you, yeah, I'm still. This is, and I think the lady next to you, is this girl, I'm gonna stand up.
She's got a workshop later too.
I'm sorry, I'm doing what at 4 o'clock, and I'm not gonna talk about this, but I think one thing, and I appreciate what everybody's saying, and I appreciate what you're saying and you're saying. I think what we have to do differently, if we have an opportunity to get older, I think we learn to appreciate things that we didn't appreciate as kids. I also think that we have an opportunity and a responsibility in being older to help perpetuate and, how can I say, disseminate information in a way that relates to the people that we're talking to. We are too busy in our entire life, from the time that we are born, we're classified. And because we're classified, we stay in those classifications. You drive a Cadillac, I drive a Volkswagen. So people have ideas just because of the car that we drive. Sometimes they just classify us in that. So I think, as, who was his name? Thicke's son, Robin Thicke, said when he did the Marvin Gaye song, we need to blur the lines. We really need to blur the lines, because you're right, we all have our own story, but it's a story that can be shared. But in order to share the story, you have to stop hiding the story of other people. And that's what happens. And so I haven't been around since the creation, but I know that every group has to struggle with, how are we going to make this work? Which generation is going to blur the lines? Which generation is going to reach out to each other authentically so that we can stop having these categories? Because even though I don't know you, Jeff, and I don't know the young lady that asked the question, I'm sure that we have some very similar stories. Our perspective and how we look at it may be different, but our stories are the same. And just trying to figure out how we're going to mesh that so we can have this conversation and dialogue that we're having now. I didn't mean to talk all this time, but I wanted to say that because once we declassify everything, it'll be kumbaya, but we got to get there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Doc. She always goes off on us. Any other questions? Any other questions? I know we're running a little bit. Well, thank you all so much. Dr. Hicks?
All right, we'll take a 2 minutes, are you ready to keep going?